In the last two lectures, we saw how the phenomenon of vagueness gives rise to a couple different kinds of fallacy, the conceptual slippery slope fallacy and the fairness slippery slope fallacy. Today, I'd like to describe another kind of fallacy that arises because of the phenomenon of vagueness. We're going to call this the causal slippery slope fallacy. So, what's a causal slippery slope fallacy? Well, here's the definition. Causal slippery slope fallacy, or causal slippery slope argument, right, because all fallacies are arguments. A causal slippery slope argument is one that exploits the vagueness of a category to argue that a particular event that you're considering, maybe a course of action that you're considering performing, or maybe just an event that you're imagining. A particular event will lead to a calamity that's causally connected to that event by a series of steps. So sometimes this is called a domino argument. Sometimes it's called a parade of horrors. The idea is there's a series of steps that eventually leads to some calamity. And so we should cut off that series of steps before it begins. We should prevent it from ever beginning, because if we allow it to begin, then it'll eventually lead to some calamity. That's the form that a causal slippery slope argument takes. So what are some examples of causal slippery slope arguments, and why are they fallacies? Well, here's some examples. So consider this. Premise one, if we let doctors euthanize patients under any circumstances whatsoever, it's likely, not certain, but likely, that we'll eventually let doctors kill patients who are depressed or in severe pain, independently of whether or not their condition is terminal or hopeless. Premise two, if we let doctors kill patients who are depressed or in severe pain, then it's very likely that we'll eventually let doctors kill patients who are a nuisance. Premise three, doctors should not be allowed to kill patients who are a nuisance, right? Simply being a nuisance shouldn't license a doctor to kill you. In conclusion, doctors should not be allowed to euthanize patients. Okay, so there's a causal slippery slope argument. What it tells us is that if we allow euthanasia, then that's going to have a certain likely consequence, which in turn would itself have a certain consequence which would be unacceptable. So we shouldn't allow euthanasia because of the indirect consequences of allowing euthanasia. Now, why is that not a good argument? Why is that a fallacy? Here's why it's a fallacy. Just because one event is likely to have a certain result, and that result is likely itself to have a certain result, it doesn't follow that the first event is likely to have that last result. Right? Consider this example. Suppose that dating leads to marriage with a 66% probability. Right? 66%, I'm just making this up obviously, but let's suppose that 66% of couples who date end up getting married. Now let's suppose that 66% of married couples get divorced. And let's suppose that 66% of divorced couples end up not being on speaking terms with each other. Okay, so it's likely that if you're dating, you'll get married. It's likely that if you get married, you'll get divorced. And it's likely that if you get divorced, then you won't be on speaking terms with each other. Let's suppose. Does it follow from that it's likely that if you're dating, then eventually you won't be on speaking terms with each other? From the premises I just gave, it doesn't follow from the fact that you're dating right now that you'll eventually end up not being on speaking terms with each other. It doesn't even follow that it's likely that you'll end up not being on speaking terms with each other. Right? Just because each event in the chain is likely given the one before it, it doesn't mean that the last event in the chain is likely given the first event in the chain, because the probability could reduce at each point in the chain. And if the probability reduces just a couple times, it could go from something could go from being likely to being unlikely. Here's another example of a causal slippery slope argument. Okay, let's suppose I say, premise one, if we allow the distribution of birth control in colleges, then it's likely that we will allow it in high schools, eventually. Premise two, if we allow the distribution of birth control in high schools, then it's likely that eventually we'll allow it in elementary schools. Premise three, we should not allow the distribution of birth control in elementary schools. Conclusion, we should not allow the distribution of birth control in colleges. Now again, why is that a fallacy? Why don't the premises support the conclusion? Just because each step in that series is likely given the preceding step, it doesn't follow that the last step in the series is likely given the first step in the series. In other words, just because it's likely that we'll allow distribution of birth control in high schools given that we allow it in colleges, and it's likely that we'll allow it in elementary schools given that we allow it in high schools, it doesn't follow from that that it's likely that we'll allow it in elementary schools given that we allow it in colleges. Likelihood is not transitive in that way. That's why causal slippery slope arguments are fallacies. That doesn't mean that their conclusions are never true. Their conclusions could well be true, but again, what we're talking about here is whether or not a causal slippery slope argument gives good support for its conclusion. And the point I'm making today is that it doesn't. A causal slippery slope argument, while it might be arguing for a true conclusion, doesn't give a good reason for accepting that conclusion. Okay, so that wraps up the topic of vagueness and the fallacies to which vagueness gives rise. In the next lecture, we'll talk about a different phenomenon, something that we call ambiguity, and we'll consider the fallacies to which ambiguity gives rise. See you next time.